Yes. Okay. Hey, welcome everybody. Today, Deacon Alex Chalikin and I are going to be talking about racism. We're not going to try to prove that racism exists. We're going to talk about the reality of racism in America. Deacon Alex is right now, he's a seminary graduate and he is a resident chaplain at a VA hospital. And you'll hear more about that. So Deacon Alex is the young guy. I'm the old guy, if you haven't figured that out. So Deacon Alex, start out. This was your idea. So start us out.
Yeah, thank you, Deadite. And the passage that I was thinking about for today comes out of Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, and it reads, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." And the reason that struck me is because dealing with the times of the treatment of colored people, of African Americans, a lot of that racism is based and slavery is based in the idea that that the privileged class is inherently better than the oppressed class. That's how the whole concept of the system works. And I think what the passage does a good job of reminding all of us is we are all slaves. Back then, it was to Egypt. In our during the time of Jesus, and as he makes clear, the struggle for eternity for mankind is our enslavement to sin. So there's always a kind of enslavement that we're always trying to throw off ourselves for the Lord to throw off of us. And I think that passage makes clear that nobody is above that idea of enslavement to something. And today's flavor happens to be racism, which is, again, really inherent to slavery. Um, um, which is inherent to that. So the reason I was thinking about it in the first place is because of the ministry I do, like you mentioned, as a chaplain at a VA hospital. The area in New York City I work is majority African American. The particular town I live in, the majority of the workers, and I'd say at least 50%, if not more, than the actual veterans. And what all that did for me was it really revealed a kind of that privilege, and to go along with it, a guilt, a shame, and embarrassment that when I spoke to so many of our veterans, many of them talk about not just the physical wounds that they have, but the wounds that society incurred on them, that they put on them. So, and especially for our African American and colored veterans, I can't tell you how many stories there were about them going onto the battlefield and being intentionally discriminated against, not just behind the scenes, but on the front lines. I can't tell you how many African American veterans and other veterans of color I spoke to that recount talking about how they were put on the front lines, and when they looked to the left and to the right, there were no white veterans or veterans representing the privileged class. And they would say the same thing about Agent Orange. Whenever they looked to the left and to the right, when the forces started deploying the chemicals, they noticed that all the white soldiers were gone, but they were still there, and they somehow magically didn't receive the memo to clear the battlefield before they unleashed the agent, the solution, that caused all that damage, biological damage to them. So I think what that experience for my chaplaincy did for me is it really humbled me and reminded me of what I'm there for. And what I'm there for is to ultimately learn about people's stories. You ask it so often of so many of us seminarians and other faith groups you lead, what is your story? And I think their story is a really important story because it not just talks about, again, the battles, the wounds that they picked up from battle or from warfare, but the real damage that's been done to their souls. And it wasn't a guy in horns and a tail and a red pitchfork. It was human beings who did this to them, human beings doing this to each other. Again, namely those privileged classes to those oppressed classes. And it really, in a sense, wounded me. It added a new, fresh wound. And but I appreciate it that experience, those experiences have been occurring because without those wounds, without those failures, there can't be any learning. There can't be any success in ministry without really rolling up your sleeves and diving deep. I think it applies to everything in life, but that's how it's affected me in my ministry as a chaplain.
Hey, tell me something. You started this with bondage and salvation from bondage, and that reminds me, Dr. Roberta Irvin, when I asked her what the Armenian word "pergochun" really means, she said to be liberated from bondage, to be liberated from slavery, prison, or bondage. What bondage? You listen to these men's stories of being damaged inside and out. What bondage? You mentioned shame. What bondage have you been liberated from with all of this?
Could say shame, arrogance too, and then the biggest one for me would be privilege. Realizing, right, that the system of privilege relies on the privileged class to not know that it even exists. In sometimes, sometimes it does, but especially in America today, you can tell that that's the whole way the system works, because when you hear comments like "all lives matter" or I don't see color. These are all, attempts by a privileged class to try to understand, but they clearly don't. And that's because the system has done such a good job. They say that it's a broken system. No, the system's working perfectly, because the system was designed to keep the privileged class from being unaware that they're in the privileged class and that there's a whole nother side to things, a whole nother America. So I think it did that for me.
You have become aware. Ha.
Yeah, it broke the bondage of my insensitivity and unawareness. That's the bondage it broke in me.
Salvation. Salvation. And I want to talk a little bit now about the Armenian church and the need for salvation. Um, I was, with all of this, Black Lives Matter, the massive peaceful protests that are going on. I was talking to my older daughter and I said, now is the time for the Armenian church to move forward with anti racism. And she said to me, Dad, forget about it. Now was 60 years ago. You're a little bit late, Dad. And so think about it, Alex, think about it. We've been here en masse, the Armenians, for 100 years, en masse, right? After the genocide. It took us a few years to become white, to become privileged, to be accepted as white. Only a few years. And
Not
we
long.
have been benefiting, but
Not long.
not long. I think it took my mom, she was born in 1921, and it took my mom until third grade, and suddenly she was white, accepted. And so we need now, we need to use all of our privilege to fight against racism. And I got a letter, I related it to you yesterday. I got a letter from, at that time, the primate of the diocese, Archbishop Torkum Manugyan, writing to me November 1968. And folks, if you know any history, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. A couple months later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. There were massive peaceful protests throughout the country. There were also cities burning because of riots. 1968. And he wrote a letter to me following my acceptance to the seminary. He wrote a letter that, to me as a young man getting out of college, I got to go get the letter. Hold on. I refiled it. Every once in a while it shows up. And I know I'm taking too much time, but this is bedrock. It's an official old diocesan stationery. It writes a 2-page letter to me, this young man that was involved in protests, and he was speaking to my heart. And I'm only going to read part of the letter. He says, listen, folks, 1968. Christians cannot isolate themselves from social justice issues, racial prejudices, 1968, political exploitation. You must begin to ask yourself, Manu, seriously, serious and disturbing questions, and to face the facts as you see them with realism, that your duty above all is to follow the example of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, etc., etc. Your love of God can only be shown for working for others' people. And where have we gotten as the Armenian Church? Alex, we haven't gotten anywhere as far as addressing racism and working for anti-racism. And I want to just ask the diocese for the bare minimum to have all of our clergy, our lay leadership attend anti-racism workshops, 2 hours, one day, something. We can do that on Zoom right away. I ask that we write curricula for teens, children, and adults on anti-racism. And here comes a bridge too far. I don't even hope for this. I'm not going to hold my breath. Being active in social justice issues. Get out there and do voter registration for people and with people. Care about those lovely dreamers. Work for bail reform for the poor. Run toward our inner city schools, being tutors, helping them buy supplies for their school. And we haven't done it in 50, 60 years. We haven't done it. Is that fear? I have no idea, and I won't analyze it. All I know, Alex, is it's time for us to cross the Rubicon. Become the Armenian Church that heals the society around us. And as you started so eloquently, so theologically, we need to liberate ourselves and our society from the bondage of racism. So I want to give you the last word because you've been quiet now for 6 minutes.
That's okay. I think you're 100% on point with that, Deadhide, and I think it's going to be a real struggle moving forward because, as you'd mentioned, we are in the privileged class now, and we know that in an ironic twist of fate, Jesus also found himself in the privileged class. The circumstances he was born into as a rabbi, and he was looked upon and he was respected given his educational training and his background. And what did he do? He said the exact opposite and did the exact opposite of what the privileged class expected him to do. It was the privileged Jewish classes and the Roman society that murdered him, not the poor oppressed people who followed him and became his first followers. So I think going back to basics and reading those fundamentals out of our scriptures is the most important thing. Who are the people who really matter in our ministry, and who are the ones who only think they matter or claim that they matter? But during these times, everyone's heart is going to be revealed. And I think during Jesus' time, he did an excellent job of showing what was underneath everybody's hearts. And I think the times moving ahead will do the same thing. And the good news for us is that 2,000 years ago, that gospel is a blueprint for us. It's a roadmap. And I suggest the Armenian Church uses it to the fullest.
I hope you're right. As I related to you tomorrow and yesterday in a short conversation, I'm tired. I'm impatient. I'm not holding my breath because I've stood alone for so long. But Alex, you're going to do it. I appreciate that. Hey, good talking to you, Alex. We're going to talk folks. We're going to talk offline now because I miss Alex. And thanks, everybody. If you stayed to the end of this, thank you for hanging around and listening. God bless you.